December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, a local civil rights activist, was taking the bus home after a long day of work as a seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man. This moment would change history. But what are some misconceptions about what happened that day? And how did this event impact Martin Luther King Jr.? What many don't know is that this was not the first incident Parks had with that particular bus driver, James Blake. 12 years earlier, in 1943, Parks had a confrontation with Blake. Keep in mind that blacks in Montgomery not only had to ride in the back of the bus, they weren't even allowed to pass through the white section on the way to the colored section. This means Parks and other blacks had to step onto the bus, pay the fare, and then step back off the bus and re-enter through the rear doors. Blake's bus in 1943 was packed. After boarding at the front to pay the fee, Parks decided to pass through the white section to the colored section, rather than trying to cram her way on at the rear doors. Blake was having none of this. He forced her to exit the bus, insisting that she must enter through the rear doors. After she got off and began making her way to those rear doors, Blake drove away without her. She vowed never to ride his bus again. On that fateful day 12 years later, however, Parks didn't realize at first that it was James Blake's bus. She paid her fare and then re-entered through the rear doors. Here's what many misunderstand, however. She did not sit in the whites-only section. She took a seat in the front row of the colored section. But then one too many white people got on the bus. According to the rules in Montgomery, this meant that all 4 people sitting in the front row of the colored section were required to get up to make room for this singular white passenger, effectively making the front row of the colored section the new back row of the white section. Well, Parks refused. Blake called the police, and Parks was arrested. Her brave stand led to a seminal event in the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, as local civil rights leaders organized what was meant to be a one-day boycott in protest. In the end, blacks in Montgomery refused to ride city buses for more than a year, walking to and from work, no matter the weather, sometimes miles every day. Blacks and sympathetic whites who owned cars also organized ride-sharing systems, with black-owned taxicab businesses playing a particularly important role. Since blacks made up 75% of the riders, many of Montgomery's buses ran empty or nearly so, impacting the city's budget. Another fact some don't know about the Montgomery bus boycott is that this was also the event that made Martin Luther King Jr. a national leader of the civil rights movement. He was a 26-year-old preacher in Montgomery at the time, and he took the lead. But it was not without risk to him and his young family. His house was bombed just 2 months into the boycott. A court decision overturned bus segregation on December 20th, 1956. The boycott ended, and blacks returned to the buses. And the first time Rosa Parks got back on a Montgomery bus, guess who the driver was? Yep, it was James Blake. Here are other events that happened today in history. In 1761, famed wax sculpture artist Marie Tussaud is born in Strasbourg, France. In 1779, Washington establishes the Continental Army's winter quarters at Morristown, New Jersey. In 1913, Ford installs the first moving assembly line for the production of an entire automobile. In 1958, a fire at an elementary school in Chicago kills 92 of the school's 1,200 students. In 1959, 12 nations signed the Antarctica Treaty, which bans military activity on the continent. In 2023, Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female U.S. Supreme Court Justice, dies at age 93. In 2024, U.S. President Biden pardons his son Hunter, who was convicted on gun and tax charges. And now it's time for our Today in History quiz. Who led a failed slave uprising in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, in the lead-up to the American Civil War? Nat Turner? John Brown? Denmark Vesey? Or Dred Scott? Liked learning about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott? Then you'll love this one about her visit to Seattle during the boycott. Tap the screen to keep the story going on Today in History.